Swamp things, werewolves, vampires, zombies. What do monsters mean? I'm not talking about the monsters that live in our closets or visit us in our nightmares. I'm talking about the monsters that live in the deep woods and the dark caves of our stories. Unlike the scaly claws that grabbed at your ankles as you leaped into bed, the monsters in our narratives don't just scare us personally, they fascinate us collectively. And they do so to the extent that we want to meet them again and again. This fascination arises from a deep-rooted sense that the monsters are trying to tell us something. And guess what? They are. Monsters have everything to do with our identity, and so do heroes and villains. Now, I want to talk a little theory first, and it's important in order to understand monsters, so bear with me a moment and let me tell you about Paul Ricoeur. He is a philosopher, and he said that our individual identity is created and clarified through our stories. When we tell the stories of our lives, or remember them ourselves, Ricoeur says there is a tension between our telling of the story and our experience of it. He says there's a competition between a demand for concordance and the admission of discordance. In the tension between concordance and discordance, the identity of the individual unfolds. To simplify, as we tell a story about ourselves, there is some pressure that we represent ourselves as we think of ourselves. But there can be an opposing sense that who we are doesn't exactly line up with that representation. This thing demands that we look at it and perhaps modify our self-perception. And this is how our identity unfolds. Yeah, this is a lot, but let me illustrate this dynamic with a personal story. When I was around 19, I went to a midnight movie with 3 friends, Jim, Mary Lou, and Stuart. I think the movie was Animal House. After the show, I stopped briefly to chat with another guy in the theater's lobby, so I left the theater a minute or two behind my friends. As I stepped outside, 4 guys in an old car aggressively pulled up to the curb and, completely unprovoked, flipped me off. Without thinking, I responded in kind and then turned to walk down the dark alley in the direction of the car. I sensed that I might be in some danger, so I picked up my pace just a little. I didn't want to appear that I was aware of the approaching threat. I knew they were coming when I heard the car doors slam and the sound of pursuit behind me. I calculated that I would make it around the corner just before they caught me. I did. My friends were ready. Jim had already told Mary Lou to get in the car and lock the door. He stood leaning casually up against the car waiting. Stuart had taken off his jacket and was lighting a cigarette. I don't know how they knew what was happening, but somehow they did. I turned and prepared to meet my pursuers with fists if I had to. The would-be assailants, thinking they would catch a vulnerable victim, rounded the corner at a run. And when they saw that it was going to be an almost fair fight, they slowed to a walk, nodded and said, "Hey," and kept walking past. As I recount this episode, there is a tension between how I see myself, how I saw myself, and what I actually said, did, and thought. I thought of myself as a nice person and a peacemaker. I'm usually good at navigating around conflict, but I didn't really behave like a peacemaker when I returned the obscene gesture. There's an inconsistency there, but I softened this inconsistency by describing my attackers as aggressive, and by showing my behavior as merely unthinking. The discordant idea is there in the story, but I suppress it in my telling. I'm not just doing it for you now. This is how I've always told the story, long before I analyze it a la Ricoeur. There's another tension in this story. Am I brave or not? In my narrative, there's no mention of the fear that I felt at the time. I've suppressed it in the telling. This omission, I think, is a result of my reluctance to admit the possibility that I'm not as brave as I like to think I am. I don't remember if there were 4 or 3 attackers, but I went with 4 in my retelling because it excuses some of the fear that I remember having. Their unwillingness to fight, even with numerical superiority, transfers cowardice onto them and keeps it off of me. I didn't run in fear. I calculated. Did you notice that? And I moderated my pace. I don't know if Stuart calmly lit a cigarette, and although I think Jim leaned against the car, I'm not sure that he was all that casual. These details have found their way into my retelling of the events, emphasizing a calm in my friends, which is transferred to me by association. As I narrate these events, there's a tension within my identity between things that align with my self-perception and those that do not. I had this idea of myself that I considered permanent, I am a nice guy peacemaker who isn't a coward. When I tell this story, there is a demand that my story presents me in this way. This is the demand for concordance. But there's also a niggling idea that who I actually am might be a little different than the way I am presenting myself. These discordant ideas, inconsistent with my idea of who I am, are demanding admission into the story. My identity is created and clarified in the tension between these two forces. So that's Paul Ricoeur. The same mechanism, I think, is at play in groups of people and their collective identity. Americans clarify their identity as Americans with stories, novels, but more and more with movies. Southerners do it with different stories. Canadians do it. The Iroquois and the Irish do it too. And the Catholics and the Mennonites. We all tell stories that help clarify our collective identity. The stories have heroes and they have villains, and both help us to understand ourselves. And these stories sometimes have monsters. Before we get into the monsters, we need to first talk a little about heroes and villains. Human beings have always told stories. The stories we tell have often helped us understand who we are as a group of people. Stories with heroes and villains and monsters are about collective identity. Our identities, both individual and collective, are shaped against other things. We know who we are in part by knowing what we are not. By knowing that I am not a deck chair, a dandelion, a Springer Spaniel, or Brad Pitt, I begin to form a picture of who I am and what I am. In other words, the self is constituted in relation to other things, in relation to otherness. So heroes. The heroes in our stories represent our ideals, our ideal selves. They embody the best of who we are, of who we think we are, and who we'd like to be. The heroes represent us. The villains are the opposite. They represent otherness. They are the not us. What makes villains bad is not primarily that they are exceptionally evil. What makes them bad is that they are exceptionally not who we are. In Hollywood's good guy, bad guy films, the good guy is often a loving family man, because we are all about the nuclear family. It's an essential part of our identity. So villains are obviously anti-family. They use women and they threaten children. When the hero destroys the villain, the threat of otherness is vanquished and the superiority of our pro-family culture is reasserted. And we walk away confident in who we are as a people. But monsters are a different thing altogether. Monsters occupy a space between heroes and villains. They function a little like villains because they are reprehensible, obviously. They're not us. But they have some qualities equally repugnant that seem just a little too familiar. These are qualities that we are wondering if maybe we might just catch a tiny glimpse of it every once in a while in ourselves. Oh, hardly ever. Not really worth mentioning, actually. The problem is the monsters are there and they have these qualities because we've been unwilling to face up to them honestly. We don't want to be that. We aren't always confident with the representations of who we are, the heroes, and who we aren't, the villains. If the boundaries between the two are clear, we can suppress our doubts. But if the discrepancy between the ideal and the real gets a little too big, well then the monsters begin to prowl around the boundaries of our identity. Think about our collective identity as a village surrounded by a protective fence. Who we are, the part associated with the hero, is within the fence. Who we are not, the area associated with the villain, is outside the fence. The fence is the boundary between the two, and in some places the barrier is strong and sure. But in other places, the barrier is a little weaker. These are the places where our identity is not so certain. It's at these spots where the monsters attack. Their very form takes the shape of our doubts about ourselves. The Greeks had the Minotaur and Medusa. The Anglo-Saxons had Grendel, the monster of the moors and marshes. Demons and witches terrorized the medieval identity. Later came Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, and the vampire, all of which attacked the boundaries of the early modern identity. Each of these monsters was a monster for a certain particular cultural identity that was in crisis. If an Anglo-Saxon storyteller conceived of Frankenstein's creature, and the next night in the mead hall he told his story about a creature composed of corpses, he'd have received an awkward silence and some very puzzled grunts from his Anglo-Saxon audience. Such a monster would not have resonated, and the first telling of that story would have been the last. The Anglo-Saxons didn't get Frankenstein. But they got Grendel, the subject of our next video, so please subscribe. Eventually, we will be taking a very deep look into the monster that embodies our doubts about who we are, the zombie horde. Pay attention to the monsters. They are trying to tell us something. See you next time.